This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Thursday, October 9th, 2025. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio, about to embark on another trip. So, I like to say that we meet almost every Wednesday, but today's Thursday, and hopefully we'll catch up again next week. But I wanted to just do a quick show about some of the work I did this week. As many of you know, the podcast also talks about things beyond gender, but that's kind of been the focus of my legislative energy because the laws have changed so quickly and there's so much at stake because people are pushing this gender identity idea into like the constitutions of some states, including attempts by Democrats in Maine to enshrine gender identity in the Maine Constitution, which is essentially would wipe out women, is the bottom line. So I have been active in fighting the battle online, engaging in like local issues as well as testifying at the state level on behalf of laws that would sort of like roll back or at least mitigate some of the damages that have, I think, been caused by this explosion of gender identity. So, one of the efforts that's taking place in Massachusetts that I gave testimony this week that I'm going to read for purposes of today's show it has to do with a bill, to set the stage. Obviously, Massachusetts, I think, is known as sort of like Transitusis. It's a very liberal state. There's 200 legislative seats, 40 for the Senate, 160 for the House, and it's overwhelmingly Democrat. So I think in the House there's like 135 Democrats. 134 Democrats. And in the Senate, out of a total of 40, there's 35 Democrats. So the Democrats rule, and the law is extremely bent towards this ideology, this gender ideology that suggests that, that biological sex isn't real and that gender identity rules the day and that any man at any time can feel strongly that he is a woman. And then all of society has to like start referring to him as her, and he gets to go in the women's prisons and he gets to be referred to in the newspapers as her and she, which really is offensive to a lot of feminists like myself. So there's a whole movement against gender identity laws, not because there's any transphobia involved. In fact, people have been supporting trans rights since as far as I can remember, but it's only since gender identity got on the scene that all of a sudden women are totally cut out of the picture. We've lost our single sex spaces. We've lost our sacred spaces. We've lost our safe spaces. We've lost our athletic competitions. And in many regards, we've lost our dignity because a lot of these deranged men who are committing these horrendous crimes in the news, including the attempted assassination of a Supreme Court justice, as well as, numerous other really bad acts, are committed by men who then have late onset gender dysphoria and identify as women and then get referred to in the newspaper as she and her, and the headlines say a woman committed this act. And that's bad enough. Then really to add insult to injury, these men who are criminals who commit crimes and then have this late onset gender dysphoria, they then declare their womanhood and have like a get out of jail free card. They get to go into the women's prison, and a lot of these guys are sex offenders, and so this is like giving them, oh, here you go, so you get to now go into the women's prison. And then the sad thing is that like so many of the women in the prison have experienced sexual violence, and so they're traumatized by having a guy come in who says he's a woman because like, most women can tell like, if you're actually a woman or if you're a man pretending to be a woman. So gender identity has really wreaked havoc on the rights of women, and it's really caused a lot of women to see with their own eyes this horrific damage committed against children in the name of gender affirming care. So there's like this alliance now of people, men, women, gay, straight, bisexual people who uh, truly support, an open and inclusive society, but believe, completely that the sexes can't be changed and that we're doing harm to society and to women to enable this gender identity shtick that sort of says any guy can go into any space and declares himself a woman. Um, so gender affirming care, like to make a long story short, gender affirming care really became it's all about money, right? You follow the money. So gender affirming care is this health scheme that suggests that these people who have gender dysphoria need gender affirming care, and it's been made a right in states like Massachusetts and Maine, and it's covered by insurance, and it's like against the law to deny someone gender affirming care if you're in a position of like state government or if you're in a public policy position in the state of Massachusetts. Essentially, I'm boiling it down. So the bill that I gave the testimony to, finally coming around to the issue of tonight's program, is a bill that's pretty exciting because it was introduced by a Republican. And as I said, there's very few of them in Massachusetts, Massachusetts. So it's a bill that was introduced by a Republican. And what it does is make as basically an insurance mandate, a covered benefit, a recognition of what it is, defined as, let's see, it is detransition related treatment. So there was a public hearing in Massachusetts this week. I signed up to give testimony live, but the hearing was so populated by people who were in support from all across the spectrum that even though I listened to the hearing for like 3 hours, my name didn't get called. So I just submitted my testimony in writing. But here it is. And if you follow along, I think you'll sort of get to the point quickly. That is, if we're going to offer and mandate gender affirming care to vulnerable people and have insurance pay for it, and therefore there's not an incentive to do it because people aren't out of pocket and they're sold this idea that somehow if they have this surgery, they're going to feel better about themselves, their life is going to be improved, they're going to fall in love, maybe they're going to mend all the relationships they have with their family. I think that's maybe an exaggeration, but maybe not. So that's what people are sold on, what gender affirming care is, that it's going to solve their problem, it's going to make them whole. Well, some people it does. Okay. And it's all covered by insurance because it's a right in Massachusetts and in Maine. But for some people, when they undergo these procedures, these like very like substantial and significant procedures, there's regret. They take a lot of drugs and maybe they have surgery and then they come to a point in their life, they're in gender dysphoria, and then maybe they get such good treatment that they're ready to get out of gender, they're ready to not have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And that off ramp is not covered by insurance. So the on ramp is if you have a suspicion that you might have gender dysphoria and you do, and then you need all this gender affirming care. Well, you have that right to it. But then if you decide that, like, you know what, in this journey, I've discovered that really deep down, my core gender is, in fact, the one that reflects the one of my biological sex, and you want to get the health care needed to get you back home, to make you whole, to heal you, it's not covered by insurance. So this bill in Massachusetts would add detransition related treatment as a mandated benefit under Massachusetts law. And I gave this testimony. Honorable members of the Joint Committee on Financial Services, my name is Cynthia Dill, a lawyer and former state senator and state representative from Cape Elizabeth, Maine. I'm here both individually and in a representative capacity for New England Women's Solidarity in support of House Bill number 1172, an act relative to insurance coverage for new treatment. News, New England Women's Solidarity, is a feminist organization of members who primarily live and vote in Massachusetts, New England, and Maine. News is dedicated to the proposition that, dedicated to the protection of women's single-sex based rights and the protection of children, including rights to detransition-related treatment as defined in this important proposed legislation. As everybody knows, under Massachusetts law, adults and minors in certain circumstances have a right to gender affirming care that is defined broadly as supplies, behavioral health, mental health, surgical, psychiatric, therapeutic, diagnostic, preventative, rehabilitative, or supportive services related to the treatment of gender dysphoria. Okay, but gender dysphoria is not defined in the law. It's assumed to mean the medical definition that's in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So gender dysphoria is a mental, psychiatric condition that's classified in the DSM-5, and that definition is sort of incorporated into the Massachusetts law. So, what it refers to, what gender dysphoria means, is distress, uh, psychological distress resulting from an incongruence between one's sex, right, male or female, and one's gender identity. And gender identity is not defined in the law. Neither is gender, but gender identity. Well, gender is basically assumed to be a set of stereotypes, and feminists have been, fighting against gender-based stereotypes, since the beginning of time, and we continue this fight. And today, this testimony and this podcast is actually in furtherance of this fight because, in my view, gender identity laws just totally reinforce gender stereotypes. Basically, they say like, okay, so if you're a girl and you think you might be like a tomboy, well, instead of just like throwing on a sweatshirt and throwing a football, what you're supposed to do is have surgery and change your name and birth certificate. That to me is just like pressuring people to conform to gender stereotypes. So this whole thing is so screwed up. But gender identity is not um, gender and gender dysphoria is not identified in the law. So, getting on with my testimony. Gender has often been construed as an oppressive, socially constructed set of stereotypes. Feminists have been fighting for centuries, and we continue this fight today. The cultural, political, and legal explosion of gender identity and gender affirming care laws has wreaked havoc on the sex based rights of women. We have lost our sacred and safe spaces, our athletic competitions, our prisons, our shelters. We all know also witness harm to children who are drugged and mutilated when they lack capacity to make informed decisions about life-altering medical interventions with questionable results. Everyone who has ever been a young adult knows that one occasionally does things they later regret, and this includes Massachusetts citizens who have received gender affirming care of puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, surgeries that include vaginoplasty, phalloplasty, maybe double mastectomies. And maybe these people later regret it, and maybe they were confused, maybe they were abused, they probably have comorbidities, maybe they grew up and just changed their mind. Um, and the only way back to their core gender, right? The only way back to their gender identity deep down is to have detransition related treatment, which is defined in this law as, medical, psychological, psychiatric treatment, including mental health treatment, medical interventions, and surgeries that stops, reverses, or helps an individual cope with the effects of prior gender affirming care. So, it's an interesting law because it's going to be hard, the morality of it makes sense, right? If we're going to cover as a society surgeries to like, affirm your gender when you're heading down the road in gender dysphoria towards this other better gender at the end of the tunnel. Well, okay, so we cover all that in terms of medical expenses, but then gender dysphoria is an actual psychiatric illness that's classified in the DSM. So, isn't the goal of society to heal somebody of that? And so, if we're successful, right? If we're actually able to get somebody like back to their core gender, then we should support them in that medical like next step, right? In the resolution of the gender identity, in the off and the resolution of the gender dysphoria, for purposes of like getting, accessing the off ramp, the last leg of the journey of gender dysphoria is hopefully its resolution. And so insurance should cover it since we already cover the steps that led you, from having a gender identity as your biological sex. Say you're born a boy, and then you have gender distress as as a teen, and you think, oh, maybe I identify as a girl. So you go down that road and you take some of this gender affirming care because it's a right and it's paid for by insurance or the taxpayers. And then, after a while you realize, like, okay, this maybe what I really wanted was some more attention from my parents. And I think I'd rather just get back to the way I was. Well, it shouldn't be out of pocket. It should be covered by insurance because if it's healthcare and it's gender affirming care, it should be included. So this bill, I was pleased to testify in support of it. Currently in Massachusetts, you're on your own for care related to gender that brings you back home. The last leg of your gender dysphoria experience, the off ramp, the resolution, is not a benefit protected by law. This makes no sense, is unfair and cruel. The legislation will fix that problem and cover detransition related treatment. And that's why I and this organization, New England Women's Solidarity, uh, support the bill. And the politics of it is that there's overwhelmingly Democrats who are going to, have to vote because that's the majority of what makes up the Massachusetts State House. But I don't think there was a lot of opposition. So Democrats now at least have to take a step, like, if they've already voted in all this gender identity nonsense, right? They made gender affirming care a law or a right. They made gender identity part of it's belts and suspenders, right? They're in on gender. So it's going to be hard for Democrats to not vote for this. And at the same time, their vote for it will open up the discussion about, what's going on. Because I think up until recently, the narrative in Democratic circles is that, like, oh, this is a civil rights issue. We got to support all this trans stuff because this is the civil rights issue of our time. Well, that's just a mistake. and and I think there's a push to separate, the LGB from the TQI, not necessarily separate, divide, in a negative way, but just kind of define the groups differently. One as a category of, who you love. There's same sex attraction, there's opposite sex attraction, there's both. That makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't involve any diagnosis, any surgery, any medical treatment. It's not. It's very different from the TQI, which is a lot of you know mental illness. I mean, that's what the bottom line is that there's maybe that'll change, but it seems like that's the difference, is that, you know, i- if you have gender dysphoria, then it's okay. You deserve to be respected under the law and treated with compassion. And I hope, obviously everybody with that diagnosis finds somebody to love, but it doesn't mean that um, you know, that society has to completely rearrange itself to accommodate your mental illness, is the bottom line. So I was pleased to give that testimony. Next week on the podcast, we're going to talk about the Childs uh, argument at the Supreme Court, the case at the Supreme Court that it's going to. There was an argument. We're looking probably for some months till a decision, but the issue is the Colorado law that attempts to ban conversion therapy, so called. And it's relevant to a lot of people because, like, in Maine, we have laws that ban conversion therapy, which at least the Child's lawyers would argue, and Child's herself, the plaintiff in that case, would argue is suppression of free speech. Because if you, in a therapeutic relationship, are forbidden by the government under the penalty of punishment from telling your patient that you think he or she should suggest a different path, should explore in their own minds a different situation to reconsider maybe some conclusions that they might have reached about their gender. Well, if that's a criminal act that like actually puts people in jeopardy of being in prison, that's pretty serious business, um, and that's exactly what it is. So for the left wing people who are having tantrums right now because they think there's such this high level of suppression of speech by the Trump administration. Just keep in mind that there's been people who haven't been able to speak freely about the biological reality of the female sex, that haven't been able to speak freely about what it has meant to have this gender ideology permeate society and give people a leg up who want to just basically enforce these ridiculous gender stereotypes. And there's a lot of women who have lost jobs, who have lost relationships, who have lost friendships because they've simply uttered the truth, and that is that trans women are not women. Trans women are men who have gender dysphoria, and women are not the equivalent of men with a psychiatric illness, right? And that's just the truth. And so I think women have been asked to do a lot over the centuries, and this is just like one ask too far. Like we're just not going to give up our sex. Like we want our sex-based spaces, we want our sacred spaces, we want our safe spaces, we want our sports teams. We want the truth to be told when a man commits a horrendous crime. Um, he doesn't become a she just because all of a sudden there's an epiphany, on the night before the indictment, and when it looks, geez, it would be a lot nicer to be in the women's prison, wouldn't it? Like, especially since I'm a pervert and I'd love to be, among all the women when they're getting undressed. I mean, why be with all the men when you can be with the women? Um, that's the reality right now. So stay tuned. Next week, we're going to have a conversation with Erin Friday, who is a lawyer who is like up to her neck in this issue. She's an expert. She'll tell us what the child's case about the ban of gender conversion therapy rather in Colorado means for for the various groups in politics, including the TERFs, the trans exclusion, whatever they are. So stay tuned, and I think, I think that's it. Signing off. Take care.